Have you ever noticed that, more often than not, it isn't our enemies who cut us the deepest? It's the ones who share our last name. It's a cruel irony. We pour years of effort, respect, and sacrifice into family, and when the moment of gratitude finally comes, what we get in return is betrayal. The humiliation of being ignored by your own blood doesn't just bruise the ego, it eats away at the soul. And here's the hard truth. People love to say, time heals everything, but that's not real. Time alone doesn't give a silenced person their voice back, nor does it erase the wound of being treated like you don't exist. What heals is the courage to turn that pain into a response. Not revenge that destroys, but revenge that sets you free. Because sometimes, the most powerful way to be heard isn't by shouting, it's by waiting for the right moment to act. And when that moment comes, the world has no choice but to see what it tried to ignore. I always thought the greatest moments in life would be about shared pride. You know, the instant your chest swells, your eyes well up, and your heart feels like it might burst. But that night, sitting in one of the last rows of a grand auditorium, I felt the opposite. The silence around me was louder than a stadium cheer. My name wasn't called. No one even glanced my way. My own son, Mark, now the head of a major construction firm, spent the entire evening thanking everyone. Professors, partners, even employees who had joined the company just a few years ago. Everyone but me. The father who raised him, who sacrificed countless nights to fund his education, sat there forgotten, invisible. Have you ever felt that? Surrounded by people yet completely alone? It's a humiliation that doesn't need insults. It seeps in like poison. The betrayal isn't just in being forgotten. It's in the deliberate effort to erase someone's existence, as if all those years of teaching, guiding, and providing meant nothing. I looked around at the crowd clapping, smiling, celebrating. None of them knew that the older man in the second-to-last row, with gray hair and calloused hands, was the father of the man being honored. Blood didn't weigh against the shine of vanity. But here's the strange part. I didn't just feel pain. I felt a clarity, like lightning cutting through a storm. In that instant, I realized dignity isn't something anyone can give us. It's something we carry, even when others try to bury it. And that applies to you, too. We often wait for recognition, from a boss, from children, from friends, even from a spouse. But the truth is, respect isn't begged for. It's proven through actions. I understood then that I had a choice. Sink into the sorrow of exclusion, or turn that humiliation into a quiet, subtle revenge, one that could restore my voice. While Mark smiled for the photographers, my mind went back to the drafting tables scattered across the room, to the building blueprints I sketched by hand before expensive software existed, to the long nights I stayed awake redoing calculations so he would have a clean uniform and school supplies the next morning. That's the foundation that made him an engineer. My sweat paid his first college tuition bills, and yet at that ceremony, it was as if none of it ever happened. Maybe you felt that too, being the cornerstone, only to go unmentioned when the house is finally complete. This is the point where many people break. I've seen parents who, after such betrayal, shrink into themselves, prisoners of their own hurt. But I didn't want that fate. I knew my freedom wouldn't come from some late apology or a half-hearted, "I'm sorry." My freedom would come from realizing I still had power, the power to decide, the power to show, not with shouting, but with action, that family isn't measured by speeches, but by respect. Have you ever thought about that? That the sharpest form of revenge is the one that never raises its voice? As the applause echoed through the hall, I felt like a man standing at a crossroads. If I got up and left, hardly anyone would notice. But if I stayed, quietly letting them believe I was just another unimportant guest, I could watch, plan, and wait for the right moment. Like in chess, sometimes it's the silent pawn that clears the way for checkmate. And right then, I began to think about how I could turn that wound into not just an answer for my son, but a lesson in dignity for everyone watching from the sidelines. Life, my friend, is made up of these moments. Not the loud battles, but the silent tests. That's when the strength of a man or woman is revealed. Anyone who's been humiliated in public knows there's no pain crueler than being ignored by the very people who should honor you. But there's also no greater opportunity to prove that true greatness doesn't need a microphone. And right there, surrounded by applause and camera flashes, I realized, to my own son, I was just another invisible guest. But that didn't mean I would stay invisible forever. I remained seated in that distant row, watching my son on stage. He spoke with confidence, called out names, praised mentors, honored business partners, even remembered neighbors who, according to him, had inspired his journey. Each one earned roaring applause, enthusiastic claps that filled the room. And me, I wasn't even a footnote in the story he was telling. That wasn't forgetfulness. It was intentional, as if he'd erased me from the map of his life. The pain I felt wasn't just a father's heartbreak. It was betrayal. A betrayal that needed no insults to be clear. It was loud in its silence. Every name spoken that wasn't mine was a strike at my dignity. Each phrase carried the same message. You don't matter. And maybe you've lived that too. When someone you lifted up decides not to acknowledge your role in their story. That's a form of humiliation that cuts deeper than any insult ever could. I remember folding my arms and taking a deep breath. I didn't cry. I didn't protest. I just went inward. And that's an important detail. When we face this kind of exclusion, our first instinct is to prove ourselves right, then and there. But I learned that respect forced in the heat of the moment rarely convinces anyone. True respect grows from action, and the most powerful revenge is the one that matures in silence, without hurry. That night's humiliation was like yeast. It burned, it swelled, it stung, but in time, it would become fuel for something much greater. I kept thinking about everything I had already done for Mark, not just financially, but emotionally. How many times did I give up buying something for myself just to make sure he had the best education? How many personal dreams did I bury so he could have a chance at the best schools? If today he was an engineer, a director at a construction company, it was because someone once believed in him when no one else did. That someone was me. But that night, he chose to ignore it in front of everyone. And that was when I realized a hard lesson. A son's ingratitude can be one of the greatest humiliations a father will ever endure. But here's the curious thing. Pain teaches. When you're excluded, you begin to see who truly values your presence. I looked around and realized no one there knew who I was. Some treated me politely, but it was just empty courtesy, blind to the story I carried. And that made me reflect on how fragile family bonds can be when they're built only on appearances. How many fathers and mothers today are being treated like they don't exist? How many gave up everything, only to now live on the margins of their own families, like inconvenient shadows? Maybe you've felt this yourself. Maybe you've tasted the bitter emotion of being forgotten at the exact moment you longed for recognition. And here's my advice. Don't try to buy respect with words, gifts, or favors. Respect can't be bought. It has to be earned. And if it doesn't come, it's because the other person hasn't yet learned how to see. What you can do is preserve your dignity. Never bargain with your values. That night, sitting in the cold, distant row, I understood something. A son's exclusion doesn't define the worth of a father. Quite the opposite. Sometimes it's in that absence of recognition that we find the chance to show our true strength. Every word left unspoken felt like a hammer striking at my dignity, but I didn't let it break me. I began to shape that humiliation into a blueprint for revenge. Not a cruel revenge, but a smart one. One that puts the weight of choices back on the shoulders of the person who tried to diminish you. Deep inside, I knew I'd still get my chance to speak. Not with shouts, but with actions that would echo far louder than any empty speech on a stage. And in that uncomfortable silence, in the sting of exclusion, I remembered something I'd tucked away years ago. The sketches, the projects, even documents that could completely change the course of this story. I knew that outside that auditorium, away from the spotlights and false applause, there was still a place where my voice mattered, and I was ready to go back there. That night, when I returned from the ceremony, I didn't go to bed. You know those nights when your head is pounding with thoughts and sleep is impossible. I needed silence, but not the humiliating silence of exclusion, the fertile silence of reflection. I walked into my garage, which had long since turned into my workshop. Inside, the smell of wood, grease, and old paper wrapped around me like an old memory. Every tool hanging on the wall, every stain on the floor told part of my story. It was there that I had built more than projects. I had built the foundation of Mark's education, brick by brick, sketch by sketch. I sat at a table covered in papers and found some of the old building plans I had drawn with my own hands. Those lines, so simple at first glance, had been the trampoline that launched my son into education. There was no luxury in my life, but there was purpose, and that purpose had given me the strength to sacrifice nights, weekends, and personal dreams. While other fathers bought new cars, I saved every cent to pay tuition, books, engineering materials. That was my choice. And ironically, it was that choice that now made the betrayal sting so deeply. I stared at those blueprints, and wondered, how many fathers carry the same story deep inside? How many pour years of sweat into the hope that their children will one day repay them with respect? The truth is, family should be the greatest school of dignity and gratitude, but too often it becomes the birthplace of humiliation. It's as if blood ties become fragile in the glow of success. And I couldn't help but think, did Mark really believe he made it all on his own? Did he imagine the education he received just fell out of the sky? And here's what I want you to see. This isn't about money, it's about memory. When we forget who helped us get to where we are, we commit one of the greatest betrayals possible, a betrayal against our own history. And when that happens, the result is always the same. The heart of the forgotten one bleeds. That night I bled, but I bled in silence, because deep down, I knew demanding recognition was pointless. Respect cannot be begged, it must be earned. And if it doesn't come, it's because the other person isn't ready to give it. As I flipped through those sketches, I remembered a piece of advice I once heard as a young engineer. Build as if you were going to live there. I always carried that with me. I raised Mark as if I would share in the fruits of his education. But when he chose to erase me, I realized I had been wrong in part. What you plant doesn't always return in the same soil. Sometimes the harvest comes from another place. And that's when I thought of my granddaughter, Olivia. Unlike her father, she always looked at me with affection. She would sit beside me in the workshop and ask questions about every drawing, as if she saw not just a grandfather, but a mentor. She was the seed I could water in a new way. And let me pause here. When you're humiliated, the natural instinct is to shut down, cut ties, give up on family. But that isn't always the path. True revenge isn't destruction, it's repositioning. It's giving each person exactly what they deserve, with wisdom. Sometimes that means redirecting your legacy. How many grandparents today step in for their grandchildren, not out of obligation, but out of love? How many choose to teach respect to a generation that still has time to learn? That may be the greatest kind of freedom, realizing you don't have to stay bound to the chain that betrayed you. As I moved the drafting boards, an analogy came to me. You know when you build a house and one of the pillars starts to crack? The instinct is to patch it, pour all your energy into fixing that one flaw. But sometimes it's wiser to build another support, to spread the weight differently. Family is the same. The child who betrayed you might be the crack, but the grandchild can become the new pillar. And at that moment I realized I still had the strength to build something new. I wasn't a man defeated by exclusion. I was a retired engineer, yes, but one who still knew how to design, calculate, and, most importantly, surprise. And in that workshop, surrounded by memories, I made a decision. If my son had ignored me in public, I would surprise him where it mattered most, in private. Not with anger, but with justice. Not with destruction, but with repositioning. The same man who once built skyscrapers could now build a life lesson. And this lesson wouldn't be sketched on blueprints. It would be drawn in choices that could reshape the entire legacy of our family. In that workshop, as the clock ticked slowly, my eyes fell on an old leather folder resting on a dusty shelf. I knew it well, but it had been years since I'd opened it. It felt almost like a safe of memories, a silent vault holding papers that had traveled through time with me. I pulled it down carefully, as if retrieving something long forgotten from the back of my mind, and a chill ran through me. Inside weren't just documents. Inside was a part of me, a part of the story Mark pretended didn't exist, but that had supported everything he'd built. I opened the folder and found yellowed blueprints, old contracts, pencil-written calculations. But what truly caught my attention was a thick envelope, its stamp faded with age. Inside were the deeds to a valuable piece of land, still registered in my name. I remembered buying that land at a time when we barely had enough to pay the bills. People called me crazy. Why buy land when you don't even own a new car? They mocked. But I knew the value of long-term vision. I chose to plant invisible seeds rather than spend on things that rust overnight. And in that moment, the emotions hit me hard. Mark had always assumed that property was already his, that being my son alone was enough to inherit without effort. But holding those papers in my hands that night, I felt something different. I realized I still had power. Not just any power, but the power to decide where my legacy would go. That thought brought me a wave of freedom, like I had finally reclaimed the right to write my own ending. It's strange how documents carry more than numbers. They carry stories, choices, sacrifices. I remembered how I negotiated for that land with sweat and denial. While others spent money on vacations, I saved every penny. That piece of earth, dismissed by many, wasn't just an investment. It was dignity, a symbol that even in humiliation and hardship, I had built something solid. And there, staring at those faded pages, I understood. Sometimes, the fairest revenge comes from what we built quietly, in silence. And let me give you some practical advice. Never underestimate the value of the seeds you plant. It might be cash tucked into an envelope, a modest piece of land, a savings account, or even a daily habit of reading you pass on to a child or grandchild. All of it becomes capital, not just financial, but moral. It's what I call invisible inheritance, the kind that never shows up on Instagram but shapes destinies. If you feel humiliated or betrayed today, remember this. Your greatest power may be hidden in those seeds, those memories, that vault of experiences only you know about. As I held those papers, a flood of thoughts rushed in. I could simply leave everything to Mark, as he expected, and close my eyes to his ingratitude. But that would only perpetuate the betrayal, validating the exclusion I had suffered. Or I could redirect this inheritance, use that land as a tool for education, for respect, for a silent form of revenge, a revenge that doesn't destroy, but teaches. And that's when I thought of my granddaughter, Olivia. Her smile, the sparkle in her eyes whenever she spoke to me, was proof that the family flame could still be preserved. I knew then I had found the key to my silent answer. There was no need to shout, no need to expose my son right then. All it would take was one well-placed signature, one strategic decision. Like in chess, you don't always need to knock down every piece. Sometimes moving a single knight is enough to put the king in check. And in that moment, I realized those yellowed papers had become my knight. Mark thought the game was already his, but there was still one move left he hadn't seen. I closed the folder carefully, as though I were putting away not just documents, but a weapon of dignity. And as I did, I felt the humiliation of the night before begin to transform into a different emotion, the emotion of taking back control. I was no longer just the betrayed father, the invisible man at the ceremony. I was an engineer again, this time, not of buildings, but of choices that could change the course of a family's future. And so, in that quiet workshop, surrounded by dust and memories, I realized life had handed me a rare opportunity, the chance to rewrite history with my own hands. And this story wouldn't be told in speeches from a stage, but in concrete actions, signed in front of those who truly matter. The next step was clear. I needed someone to help me turn these papers into a final binding decision, and I already knew exactly where to go. The next morning, I woke lighter, though not naive. The wound from the night before still burned. The sting of being treated as invisible doesn't vanish in hours, but inside me burned a different fire. The sense that what I held wasn't just a stack of old papers, but the chance to reclaim my dignity. I made myself a simple cup of coffee, the kind that reminds you of a life without luxuries, and looked once more at the folder. The time had come to act, not with anger, but with strategy. I picked up the phone and called Mrs. Harris, a respected attorney in town, a woman with a firm hand and a steady reputation. When I told her I needed to discuss my will, she gave me an appointment that very day. As I drove to her office, the irony of life hit me. For years, I had planned that land and those savings as an inheritance for Mark, believing he would honor my story. But after witnessing his silent betrayal, I finally understood. Inheritance is not just money. It's respect. It's continuity. It's the education carried with dignity. And if he had torn apart that moral contract, I had every right to rewrite the legal one. When I entered Mrs. Harris's office, I felt the calm of someone about to turn a key in a locked door. She welcomed me with that blend of professionalism and compassion only a few people carry. I explained everything without hiding the emotion, the ceremony, the exclusion, the way I had been treated like a stranger in the very life I had built. She listened quietly, the way few know how to listen these days. Then she adjusted her glasses, opened the documents, and said calmly, "You have every right to decide where your legacy goes. Property isn't just bricks and concrete. It's your story. And if someone refuses to respect it, maybe they don't deserve to receive it." In that instant, I realized revenge doesn't need to be loud. My revenge would be carried out with a pen. While others scream to prove who they are, I would simply sign in silence. I redirected the land and my savings to my granddaughter, Olivia, that little girl who visited me in the workshop, who asked me curious questions, who smiled as if to say, "I see you, Grandpa." She, not Mark, deserved to carry on my story, because true respect isn't shouted, It's recognized in the smallest of gestures. Signing those papers felt like lifting a weight off my shoulders. It was a freedom I hadn't felt in years. Not because I was taking something away from Mark, but because I was giving back to myself the dignity he had tried to strip away. It was like finding an old key you'd forgotten about for decades, only to realize it still opens doors. That's exactly how I felt. The key was right there in my unexpected decision, and I turned it with confidence. Let me give you a real-life example. So often, we stay tied to toxic family ties out of sheer obligation. How many parents keep supporting ungrateful children? How many grandparents let their voices be silenced just to avoid conflict? What I've learned is that true education isn't about pleasing. It's about teaching. And sometimes teaching requires firmness. It's like pruning a tree. It hurts, but it allows healthy growth. My decision to change my will wasn't just a legal act. It was a life lesson for Mark. The lesson that respect isn't inherited, it's earned. As I signed, I thought about how many people live under the illusion that revenge has to be destructive, but the most powerful revenge is the one that transforms pain into justice. I didn't need to humiliate my son in public. I didn't need to raise my voice. One signature was enough. And there, in that office bathed in morning light, I felt more alive than in any grand ceremony. Because at last, I realized I didn't need Mark's approval to be free. I walked out of Mrs. Harris's office slowly, but with my head high. The sun hit my face and I breathed deeply, like a man reborn. The emotion I felt wasn't victory over my son, but reconciliation with myself. That's a kind of liberation few people ever experience. The realization that dignity doesn't depend on someone else's gaze. It depends on your courage to make decisions aligned with your truth. And that's exactly what I had done that day. I placed the copy of my new will back into the folder, but this time not as a burden, as a symbol that I still had a voice, that despite the humiliation I'd suffered, I could turn betrayal into a lesson, and ingratitude into an example. And deep inside, a quiet anticipation grew. I knew this choice would have consequences. I knew the time would come when the perfect moment to reveal it would arrive. And when it did, no spotlight could drown out the power of my decision. Months passed since that day in Mrs. Harris's office. The folder was no longer a dusty burden hidden in my workshop. It had become a silent emblem of the fact that I had taken back control of my own story. Time, curiously, didn't erase the pain of betrayal, but it reshaped it into fuel. With every visit from my granddaughter Olivia, every smile from her, I was reminded, "You're not alone, Grandpa. Your voice still matters." And it was in that certainty that I found strength. Until the day arrived when all eyes in the city would once again turn to Mark, the grand opening of his new skyscraper. The event promised to be extravagant, luxurious invitations, a guest list filled with business leaders, politicians, journalists. That building wasn't just steel and glass. It was the crown jewel of the empire Mark believed he had built on his own. I could have stayed home, but I knew this was the perfect stage. Not for instant revenge, but to prove that a man's dignity cannot be buried in silence. So I put on my simplest suit, carefully combed my hair, and made my way to the auditorium where the ceremony would be held. I arrived early, but didn't seek attention. I sat quietly in the back, almost like any other guest. Looking around, I saw cameras positioned, journalists scribbling notes, and guests exchanging empty smiles while waiting for the show to begin. The whole scene made me think about how society values the glitter of success more than the roots that sustain it. How many people there knew my story? How many realized that behind that skyscraper were years of sacrifice, education, and sleepless nights? None. To them, Mark was a lone genius, a man who had built an empire by himself. And that, ironically, gave me even more clarity. I didn't need their recognition. What I needed was to wait for the right moment for the truth to surface. And it wouldn't be through anger or shouting. It would be through calm. Because the most powerful revenge doesn't rely on violence. It relies on intelligence. I had already learned in my workshop that silence itself can be a well-designed project. And there, sitting in the last row, I waited for my opportunity, like an engineer waits for the perfect moment to set the final beam in place. As the master of ceremonies announced the inauguration, I watched Mark on stage. He spoke with confidence, smiled for the cameras, soaking in applause and camera flashes after every sentence. It was as if he had completely forgotten the humiliation he'd caused me months earlier. But inside me, there was no anger, only quiet emotion. I knew that stage wasn't his alone. I had a role to play too, and it would be remembered. I thought about how many mothers and fathers watching the event on TV at that very moment were probably feeling what I had felt. The the pain of being unrecognized by their own families, and I hoped, with all my heart, that what I would do that night might serve as a beacon for them. Have you ever noticed how certain places seem to call for a reckoning? That auditorium was exactly that for me, not for blind revenge, but for justice. I had already made my decision in the silence of the lawyer's office. Now was the time to transform that decision into a public gesture, not for vanity, but to show that respect cannot be buried. That dignity, once wounded, demands a response. And deep inside me was a calm that almost felt ironic. While everyone saw Mark as untouchable, I knew that all it would take was opening a folder to make his glass castle start to crack. And here's a thought for you. How many times have you felt small in a crowd applauding others but blind to you? That feeling of invisibility can be suffocating, but it can also be an opportunity. The secret is patience. Just as any good engineer knows, no structure rises without a plan. If you're waiting for your moment, remember, it will come. But it must come at the right time, with the right gesture. That's what I had learned, and that's what guided me that night. The auditorium buzzed with celebration, but my heart was steady, prepared. I was no longer just the humiliated father from the last ceremony. I was a man who had turned pain into a blueprint, humiliation into strategy, betrayal into opportunity. And as I slowly rose from my chair, carrying the folder that had gathered dust, in my workshop for years, I knew this was the moment when my silenced voice would be heard again. I was ready to prove that I could still build something greater than any skyscraper. Respect. The master of ceremonies called out important names, while Mark received every compliment as if he were being crowned king before the entire city. Businessmen clapped, journalists scribbled notes frantically, and cameras caught every detail. I sat in the back, feeling the weight of the folder on my knees. It wasn't just paper. It was the sum of years of struggle, sleepless nights, silent sacrifices, and I knew this was the right moment, not to destroy my son, but to show that a man's dignity cannot be erased by ingratitude. When my name was announced, I noticed people looking around at each other. Some didn't even know who I was. To them, I was just another guest, maybe a retired engineer or an old employee. They had no idea I was the invisible foundation beneath this story. I walked to the stage, slowly, with steady steps. A hush began to spread, the murmurs fading. It's strange how sometimes the most powerful sound is the silence before a revelation. On stage, I didn't begin with polite acknowledgments or flashy lines about the company's success. I held the folder, took a deep breath, and let my emotion lead. "Good evening," I began, locking eyes with the audience. "Many of you don't know me, but perhaps you should. My name is Joseph. I'm a retired engineer and Mark's father." The impact was instant. I heard whispers, saw wide eyes. Journalists lifted their heads like they realized the real story was just beginning. I opened the folder slowly, pulling out the papers like revealing a secret kept for decades. For years, I worked in silence. Every drawing, every calculation, every project was what made possible the education that built this brilliant career. But tonight isn't about the past. It's about a decision I had to make. I paused, letting the words hang heavy in the room. The air was thick with curiosity, tension, discomfort. Tonight, before all of you, I officially announce the transfer of the land and financial fund that many assumed would naturally belong to Mark. No, they now belong to my granddaughter, Olivia. The hall erupted in shock. Whispers swelled, eyes darted, journalists scrambled to write. Even politicians leaned toward each other, trying to grasp the magnitude. I saw it clearly. Mark's confident face drained, his eyes once sharp, now glassy and uncertain. And let me pause here with you. Life always gives us the chance to turn the game around. We often think we're at a disadvantage, humiliated, voiceless. But all it takes is one well-planned move to flip the story. My revenge wasn't to shout or expose personal flaws. My revenge was to show, in front of everyone, that respect is not optional. It is the foundation of every relationship, family or business. When you're betrayed, you don't need to stoop down. You just need to remember that your dignity is your greatest weapon. As I spoke, I noticed something in people's eyes I never expected. Emotion. I saw older men nodding discreetly in approval. I saw women wiping tears. They understood this wasn't just my story. It was the story of countless parents forgotten, humiliated in silence within their own families. Suddenly I realized my voice wasn't only personal, it was collective. I was speaking for everyone who had ever been made invisible. I closed the folder and gripped the podium. Respect isn't inherited, it's earned. Inheritance without dignity is worth nothing. Today I choose not by blood, but by character. And if my grandson or granddaughter ever asks who I was, I want them to know. I was a man who refused to stay silent in the face of betrayal, who never let humiliation have the last word. The silence after my words was absolute. There was no going back. The truth had been spoken, and in that moment, I felt something deeper. I no longer needed my son's approval to feel true emotion. The liberation was in knowing my voice had been heard, my dignity restored. The rest, the stares, the whispers, the fallout, would come later. But right there on that stage, I had already won. As I walked back to my seat, I realized the real collapse wasn't mine. It was about to be Mark's. When I finished my speech and closed the folder, I could feel the atmosphere of the auditorium shift. It was no longer a party. It was as if a heavy weight had dropped over. Everyone, the businessmen who had been smiling moments earlier, now whispered uneasily, casting sidelong glances at Mark. Journalists wrote furiously, some even standing to capture the moment more closely. Politicians present, always quick to sense winds of prestige or scandal, averted their gaze, not wanting to be tied to him. And in that whirlwind of reactions, I saw my son lose his footing. The man who, minutes ago, spoke with such confidence, now looked small. His proud eyes were wide with panic. The camera-ready smile had vanished. The mask of success, of power, of control, fell off in front of everyone. He was no longer the construction magnate. He was just a son who had betrayed his father. And the humiliation I had carried for years was now revealed publicly before them all. Don't get me wrong. I didn't feel pleasure in his suffering. What I felt was justice. The emotion that swept through me wasn't bitter revenge, but balance restored. Life, in its irony, was giving back in, double what I had endured. And notice, I didn't have to shout, didn't have to point fingers. All it took was revealing the truth, with dignity, for everything to crumble. That's the lesson I want to share. The strongest revenge is the one that forces the other person to face themselves in the mirror, in front of everyone. As I looked at Mark, I noticed even his wife turned her eyes away. The woman who once flaunted her husband's prestige now looked ashamed. Some of the company's partners whispered nervously, perhaps wondering if it was still worth standing by him. Even friends who claimed to be close began to edge away. And that's when I understood something powerful. Respect that doesn't come from within can uphold appearances for a while, but in the face of truth, it collapses. Here's a piece of practical advice. If you've been humiliated, don't rush to strike back. Time, paired with truth, is the greatest architect of justice. When someone betrays your trust, the temptation is, to hit back with anger. But the intelligent revenge is the one that preserves your dignity and exposes their contradictions. That's what happened with Mark. He didn't fall because I pushed him. He fell because his own choices had no foundation. I saw it clearly. He tried to speak, but no words came out. The microphone was right there, but his throat closed up. It was as if life itself forced him to swallow the words he had once denied me. And that silence, for me, was louder than any speech. Because anyone who has endured the humiliation of exclusion knows there is no deeper pain than being unseen. And that night, before everyone, the tables turned. The invisible one wasn't me anymore. It was him. I realized this was revenge in its purest form, returning, without hatred, exactly what I had received. He made me invisible at one ceremony, and now, at his grandest celebration, he was the one who could no longer be seen with respect. That reversal wasn't luck, it was the direct consequence of his own choices. And that's where true freedom lies, realizing you don't need to get your hands dirty to win. You just need to stay faithful to your dignity. As I walked back to my seat, I noticed Mark's eyes searching for me. The arrogance was gone. The vanity had vanished. What was left was desperation. For the first time in a long time, he looked at me and actually saw the father he had ignored. But I knew it wasn't time for apologies yet. First, he would have to face the full weight of public humiliation, because only those who fall understand the value of standing again with humility. And in that abyss of shame, he began to show the first signs of seeking something he had never truly offered before: remorse. But could words alone rebuild a broken bridge? When I sat down after the revelation, I felt a strange silence fill the air. It wasn't the cold silence of betrayal I had endured at that first ceremony. It was heavy, emotional, suffocating. All eyes were on Mark, waiting for his reaction. And then I saw something I never imagined. My son, once so proud, walking toward me with hesitant steps, like a man finally realizing the weight of his choices. He was trembling, The same Mark who could face cameras and executives without blinking now looked lost. His eyes brimmed with tears, his breath shallow. He came close, and in front of everyone, he began to speak. "Dad, forgive me." The words I had waited years to hear finally came. But they didn't come in a private room or in a rushed phone call. They came there, in front of everyone, on the very stage where he had erased me months earlier. The irony of life is this: humiliation, when transformed into dignity, always finds its way to redemption. The audience looked at one another. Some seemed shocked, others wiped away quiet tears, because this wasn't just a scene between father and son. It was a human moment about respect, family, and liberation. I looked him in the eyes and saw sincerity mixed with despair. He knew he had gone too far. He knew he had built an empire on a cracked foundation, and now he was asking me to help rebuild it. But here's a truth few are willing to admit. Forgiveness isn't instant. Pretty words don't glue back the pieces of a shattered relationship. I knew that, so I stayed silent. I looked at him, let him speak, but inside I repeated, "The real bridge between us won't be made of words. It will be made of actions." How many children say quick, "I'm sorry," to their parents, only to repeat the same mistakes the next day? And how many parents, caught up in emotion, forgive too quickly, only to suffer another round of humiliation? I refused to fall into that trap. What I wanted wasn't just to hear, "I'm sorry." What I needed was proof. I needed to see transformation. I needed Mark to understand that respect isn't currency you trade. It's the foundation of any family bond. That's why, even as I heard his voice breaking, I didn't respond right away. I breathed deeply, letting the weight of silence become part of his lesson. Because sometimes, the hardest lesson isn't in what we say, it's in what we withhold. And let me speak directly to you. If someone in your family humiliates you, then later comes asking for forgiveness, remember, you have the right to ask for more than words. Demanding actions isn't revenge, it's education. It's the chance to show that family ties only survive when there's real respect. If you settle for less, you risk repeating the cycle of betrayal and humiliation, and you don't deserve to live chained to that cycle. As Mark knelt before me, I saw in his eyes the boy I once believed in, but also the man who had erased me. That contradiction cut deep. The emotion was powerful, but reason reminded me. It isn't enough to cry on a stage. You have to prove yourself day by day. Rebuilding requires action, dignity, humility. That moment was symbolic, yes, but it would be worthless without real change. So I placed my hand on his shoulder, looked firmly into his eyes and said only, "It's not me who has to prove I forgave you. It's you who has to prove you've changed." The audience drew in a collective breath, as if understanding there were no shortcuts to reconciliation. True forgiveness isn't magic. It's built, brick by brick, like any building. And if Mark wanted to rebuild the bridge between us, he would have to learn to be the engineer of his own transformation. And that's when I realized the story wasn't over. His apology was only the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter that could lead to liberation, but only if he gave me what he had never truly given before: action. That night, I felt the burden was no longer mine, it was his. When the lights of the auditorium began to dim and people slowly left, I remained seated for a few moments, not because I was waiting for anything, but because I needed to feel the weight of what had just happened. For years, I had carried the pain of betrayal and the scar of humiliation. How many times had I asked myself if my voice would ever be heard again? Well, it had, not with shouting, but with calm, not with bitter revenge, but with a firm, just response. As I walked toward the exit, I realized something. I didn't feel anger toward Mark. I didn't want to see him destroyed. What I felt was freedom. It was as if after carrying heavy stones on my back for years, I had finally set them down. The feeling wasn't victory over him. It was victory over myself. I had proven, not to the world, but to me, that my dignity was intact. And here's the lesson I want to leave you with. True revenge isn't destroying the one who hurt you. It's freeing yourself from the weight of their wound. It's realizing you no longer need their apology to move forward. Liberation comes when you understand that respect begins within, and if you preserve your dignity, no one can make you invisible. That night, under a starry sky, I smiled to myself. I thought of how many parents live with the same pain I had carried. How many have been humiliated by their own children, forgotten, treated like burdens. And I thought, If only they knew they still have power, maybe they wouldn't feel so defeated. Because power isn't about controlling others. It's about deciding what to do with your legacy, your story, your voice. That's what I did. And that's a choice anyone can make, even in the most fragile of family relationships. As I walked slowly toward the car, I thought of my workshop. That simple space filled with yellowed papers had been the place where I planned the turning point of my story. It was there that I turned humiliation into a blueprint and betrayal into strategy. And in remembering it, I understood that deep down all of us need a refuge of reflection, a place where we can think without outside noise, without other voices. It might be a workshop, a bedroom, even a park bench. What matters is having a space where you can quiet the world long, enough to hear your own conscience. And here's some practical advice. If you're going through a painful season, find that refuge. Write in a notebook, organize your memories, revisit your victories. Often, the very thing that will set you free is already with you, like the papers I rediscovered. Revenge doesn't start on the outside. It starts within, when you decide you will no longer live as a prisoner of humiliation. That decision alone is already an act of dignity. That night, as I started the car and saw the city lights reflecting on the windshield, I felt a different kind of peace. Not the peace of reconciliation with Mark. That would depend on his actions. It was the peace of reconciliation with myself. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I was seen by me, respected by me, valued by me. And that's a kind of liberation no one can take away. It was then that I realized something I'll carry to the end of my days. Sometimes, only when the invisible speaks, does the whole world finally learn to see. In the end, the greatest liberation doesn't come when someone else asks for forgiveness. It comes when you decide not to live chained to betrayal and humiliation anymore. Respect isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. And dignity isn't something you negotiate. It's something you defend. The real question is, how long will you allow your voice to be erased inside your own family? Think about it. How many times have you stayed silent out of fear of losing someone when, in truth, you had already lost the most essential thing, respect? And if today was your moment to turn the tables, what decision would you have the courage to make? Will you keep waiting for others to change, or will you start with your own change? Let me challenge you. Which part of this story spoke to you the most? What step do you feel you need to take in your own life to reclaim your dignity? Share it in the comments. Your story might inspire others who are going through the same thing. And if this story touched your heart, if it made you reflect on respect, family, and what truly holds us together, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because with every new video, you'll find not just emotion, but practical lessons to make sure you never let anyone silence you again.